Hey everybody, it's Romania Black, and we are at the halfway point of season 1 of Vinland Saga, episode 12. I'm very excited. I'm very excited. The mystery box of Canute keeps giving to us, and now we're like, is Canute a woman? Is it just a very feminine looking man with really great hair? What's the story, Morning Glory? We're going to find out. But I made some pretty wacky theories, and I've been watching ahead to try to get ahead of spoilers because I don't want people giving me any hints or clues or things like that. And I'm sure that those of you watching are probably going to be like, wow, really, Romania? You thought that? Okay. Because I've got some comments before we start episode 12, but Whoosh and Sweebian, I know that you didn't mean to spoil, and you could not have known that I'd watched ahead and made all these wacky predictions, but in the Discord, they were like, oh yeah, so the priest is named Willibald, and I was like, well, there goes my priest theory. I was like, whoops, I guess that's going to seem real sheepish. But it's Willibald, and then their VA is Hino Satoshi that voices Moran from Moriarty the Patriot, Daichi from Haikyuu, now from Free, and I was like, okay, yeah. I didn't know. We've not heard Canute speak, so I have not been able to see who Canute's voice actor is, and I don't want to know until we get confirmation about them. So they didn't mean to spoil, but I was like, well, there goes that theory. So that's all right. It was going to probably come out in this episode anyway, right? But yeah, so I don't want to know any voice actor info until we get confirmation of them speaking, which we did with the priest. So I guess, my theories about Canute, I want to be surprised. And so here we are. But I do have some other comments. Edgar talked about how Thorfinn is stuck in the cycle of violence, and he's become really desensitized by it because back a couple episodes ago, I think it was episode 10, Thorfinn wakes up next to that dead body and it doesn't even faze him. He's so desensitized to the violence at this point. And about how his subconscious is saying that he needs to go and live a life, abandon this revenge, don't keep going after it. But Thorfinn has so much tunnel vision that he just can't see past it. Meanwhile, with Askeladd, he knows his place in the scheme of things. He knows where he stands, and he's very self-aware of his role, whereas Thorfinn does not seem self-aware, right? He thinks he is, but he's not really, right? And so Askeladd knows what goes on within the world, and so he's trying to, it's interesting, in episode 10, Askeladd's almost trying to give Thorfinn a lesson, being like, here's how the world works, and Thorfinn just ignores him, and it's like, oh, damn it. But I thought that was interesting. Tamir noted that Thorkell is basically Bokuto from Haikyuu. I was like, oh my god, he is. If Thorkell ever says, hey, I'm gonna lose it. I think he's kind of gotten close to saying it, but not with the same cadence as Bokuto. But I laughed really hard reading that comment, Tamir. That was really great. And then finally, Ritisante, Rticante, noted that Ritisante said that there are lots of contradictions with our characters. And I thought that was really important to note at this point because, yeah, much like humanity itself and how we are all complex creatures and we are full of contradictions, so are our three main characters in this. Thorkell and Floki, as he notes, are pretty clear cut in their motivations. We know Thorkell and Floki. We kind of get they're much flatter characters at this point than Bjorn, Askeladd, and Thorfinn. So their motivations are a little bit clearer. Now, if we get to know more with their characters, that may change. But they're pretty solid characters. They're easy to understand. Thorfinn has this very interesting contradiction where he seems disgusted by violence. He seems like he doesn't like it at all, and that kind of goes back to his father's teachings to him, but he sees it as inevitable. He's like, if I'm going to get this revenge, I've got to be encompassed with this violence, so it's just inevitable. It's going to happen. He sees it as just something that's obligatory, even though he's disgusted by it, and that's kind of contradictory because it's like, well, if you don't like it, get away from it or don't do it, and he doesn't do that, so that's interesting. And then you have Askeladd, who's kind of an opportunist, but yet he respects his warriors and the warrior code and goes along with it. So that seems like they're kind of in opposition, which is interesting. And then I agree, Bjorn, we don't know much about Bjorn. He's very quiet and keeps things close to the vest. And we don't exactly follow him like we do Askeladd as a protagonist or as a main character. And so his principles, they seem like they contradict with Askeladd's, which is interesting because they're so close. they're so very much close in terms of their relationship, but they seem like they disagree a lot. So I'm like, So that's really interesting. But yeah, we've got this whole mystery with Canute. I just want to know if it's a man or a woman and get confirmation. I'm assuming we're going to get that this episode because they've made Canute take off the helmet. I just want, if Canute speaks 3 words and I know it's a man, I'll be like, okay, that'll take care of half of my theories. So I just need that to happen this episode. So I'm watching a little bit ahead so that we get to that point. So yeah, but we're at the halfway mark in the series. We've set everything seemingly up. I'm like, okay, now we're going into the second half. Is there going to be like a tonal shift? It's been pretty brutal so far, so I assume it's just going to keep ramping that up. But okay. So let's find out, shall we? I'm curious to see what's going to happen and what we end up dealing with in this episode. So we're going to start Vinland Saga episode 12, and we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let's go. So this series gets more and more interesting. I was like, wait a minute, what? This episode, very interesting. So, okay. I will say first and foremost, before I get into this discussion, because I feel like it's going to come up in the comments, I am an English major. I'm not a history major. Geography is my worst subject. The worst. I'm good with directions, but as far as when you give me a map, I'm like, cartography is not my thing. Geography is like the worst subject in the world. Unless I have a map and see it right in front of me, I'm pretty much useless telling you where things are, unless I have the map to identify them. So a lot of the things I'm going to say, I can just see in the comments somebody being like, well, don't you know where Wales is? And don't you know your British history? No, I don't know British history. I was like, I think the last time I've done any studying of British history was in junior high. Like, that's how far removed I am from this. And I kind of like that with this series because it helps me be surprised when things pop up. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. That all makes sense. It allows me to be really surprised by what I learned from this series and how things all tie together. That helps, I feel like, my experience of it going in as somebody that really is blind to the subject matter. It makes it more fun to watch and kind of break it down. But I'll say first and foremost, I know I'm probably going to say some things in these comments that people, in this discussion, that people in the comments will be like, well, shouldn't you know? And I'm like, I don't. So, and that's the thing too. I am all about going into this series and being surprised. So I don't necessarily want to know historical elements that are going to pop up later. And so I don't really want to know that. But if there is something tied to what I'm going to talk about in this particular discussion, feel free to comment down below. But if it's something that's going to come up in later episodes, I don't want to know that yet. I want it to like naturally feed into the discussion. But yeah, this episode was weird. It was weird in a really good way because Askeladd's being sketchy and is seemingly tied to these Welsh people. I'm like, is he part Welsh? Is he even Danish? Is he? I mean, that's the thing. He's like, is he actually who he says he is? That's the curious thing. Like, Askeladd is a mystery box in himself, much like Canute. And we get little bits and pieces of Askeladd as we go, but we don't really know a lot about him. Or about his character in general. We've been slowly peeling back those layers as we go, but we're really pretty clueless as to where Askeladd's come from. And he's an opportunist, but he also knows how the system works, and he seems to have friends in high places. Like his uncle is Danish, so that's interesting. His uncle is Danish, but we don't know, that could be tied to his father. We don't know much about his mom. These people from Wales know who he is. So is his mom Welsh and his dad was Danish? We don't know, right? Or is even his uncle in Denmark, is his uncle even really his uncle, or is it more like a metaphorical, like figurative relationship? We don't know exactly, right? We don't exactly know a lot about Askeladd's character. So he's the son of Olaf, so which seems like a Danish name, but Lydia is his mom. So we need to just break this down. Bjorn was fun in this episode because Bjorn's like, why are you being weird? I feel like Bjorn was like the audience surrogate. Like, what's going on with you? So I want to break this episode down. My dog is at my feet, so I literally can't move. But let's look at Askeladd. We, again, don't know a lot about him, but we know that his dad supposedly is Olaf, and his mother supposedly is Lydia. Now, whether that's all true or not, Askeladd, he's kind of mysterious, right? So, and he's not afraid to lie, so to get what he wants. So that's kind of the fun part, is that trying to figure out and piece together, what is Askeladd being truthful about? What is he putting up a facade about? What is he lying about? What is he truthfully lying about? It's like just trying to figure him out is fun, because he's very difficult to figure out, right? So we could tie that maybe, and I don't want to be proven right or wrong, but his mother could have been from Wales, and his dad could have been from Denmark. He could be like a half-blood, you know, and that would be interesting, because we'll talk about the accent and everything with that as we get to it. But man, whenever they start out with the OP, I'm like, And this episode was so frustrating at first, because they did not reveal they did not reveal the conversation of what happened immediately after with Canute. Just completely glossed over it. They're like, well, we saw Canute with the helmet. Bye. We're going to piece right over that. I'm like, I shouldn't be surprised at this point, but still. So the land on the far bank. And there's clearly no fish. Like, I cut to that man's basket and there's just nothing there. But he's in charge of the ferry, so the fishing is just something he's doing to kill the boredom, right? There's a lot going on in this episode in terms of morale, in terms of things behind the scenes. Canute is interesting. What's going on with Canute? We assume it's a guy at this point. Okay. But yeah. But Askeladd also goes alone. And the armor and everything he wears, now it makes much more sense that the armor that he has on is Welsh, right? It's tied to Wales, right? Right? That's why his armor looks so distinct. And nobody really questions him about it, because it's Askeladd. But he goes by himself to go to see this fisherman, which I thought was interesting at first, because usually Askeladd doesn't really do anything by himself. He usually has Bjorn come with him, or Thorfinn comes with him, or somebody. He rarely does things like by himself unless he feels there's absolutely no threat. So clearly he thought this fisherman was not a threat at all. And so he's asking if the fish are biting. He's like, they're already in hibernation, right? Like him making small talk with this man, his accent comes out. We find out that he was speaking in English to this man, and his accent is there. So I wonder if that was Askeladd proving to the man that they're one and the same, they're from the same place. And he's like, I don't care if I catch anything. My job is operating the ferry. So it's a cool tie-in that this man is putting up the facade of being a fisherman, when in fact his real job is to ferry people across the river. And so that's kind of a nice tie-in, that Askeladd, is he putting up the facade of doing this whole deal with the Vikings when really he's something else. So this is like, is there a facade with him? The answer is yes. Is there a facade? But we don't know how big the facade is. Is it all just tying back to episode 8 with him? Is Askeladd, is the facade really like just who he is, you know, in general? Or is there something like, is he bigger? Is he more important than he's letting on? Because the main guy at Wales that greeted them knew Askeladd. And it seems like you wouldn't know a guy like that unless you were somebody important, or unless you'd visited them a lot. And I don't think Askeladd's visited them a lot, so that leads me to think he's somewhat important. But these other guys don't know. So, mysterious. He's like, you guys are Danes, right? You speak good English, but you have a bit of an accent. He's like, your accent sounds like people from my country. So that's interesting. He's like, so the fisherman and him seem like they're from the same area, right? So curiouser and curiouser. So it's establishing that Askeladd, he is multilingual. Again, interestingly enough, which is funny because Thorfinn's not. Thorfinn does not know English, and several of their men do not know English. So that's not something common among the Vikings. Most of them have no clue what they're saying. So the fact that Askeladd is fluent in English is interesting. Like, can't imagine how you would have learned it. And so he asks how much it costs to go to the opposite shore. And he says 2 pieces. Well, if you don't have silver, I'll also take alcohol. But he's like, I don't know how many days it would take me to bring all of you. That's the thing. So that ties to why he had... It's a big mystery in this episode of what Askeladd's doing. It's all very mysterious, right? And Askeladd is a schemer. He's a planner. And so he's like, okay, I'm going to plan. He knows that the ferry, the man saying, I could ferry you across this river, but I don't know how long it would take for me to go back and forth and take all of you. He's like, that's going to take a while. And that's time they don't have because Thorkell's men are marching quickly. They're catching up with them. So Askeladd's like, okay, I'm going to go and ask for a favor from the other side and see if they'll help us. And he name drops someone very important. His mom, he name drops, being like, I'm the son of Lydia. So it's like, So Askeladd, he needs a big ferry across the river. So he's like, I need a big ferry across the river. And so he sends a letter to Wales. Okay. He sends a letter to Wales. And he's like, I need you just to bring this. And it's sealed and everything. It looks rather important. At first, when I thought that he was handing the letter to the fisherman, I thought it was a letter from Canute. Like Canute had wrote it and Ragnar had like done this special Denmark seal and he was going across the river to like take it to the main army. That's what I thought was happening. When he said he was getting reinforcements, I thought he was going to tell King Sven, be like, look, we need to get some reinforcements. Thorkell's men are coming. We're not going to be able to handle it. And we'll talk about why later on in the episode, like the morale of the troops and where we're at with that. We'll talk about that. But that's what I thought he was doing. I thought he was giving this letter to go to the main army and say, hey, can you send us some guys to help? This is from the prince. It looks very official because the prince wrote it, like saying that we've got the prince in our clutches, but we can't give him back to you unless you send us more men. That's where I thought it was going, but then thankfully it takes a whole different turn, right? So this guy's like, oh, I thought you were customers, too bad. He's like, well, who do you want me to deliver it to? And Askeladd's like, to one of the elders. It's urgent. And Askeladd's over 40, so he's middle-aged. He's pretty up there. So he tells it to take it to one of the elders of Wales. He says, take it to one of the elders. And then he's very serious. He's like, tell them it's from Askeladd, son of Lydia. So his mother's Welsh. And the guy looks at the armor he's wearing and the sword and is like, oh, that's where you're from. You sound Danish, but you've got some other blood in you. It's like, understood. I'll hurry. Yeah, so okay. That's so interesting. Like getting just a tiny breadcrumb of information on Askeladd is like huge in my book because I'm like, I want to learn more about his character and he plays things so close to the vest and he's so mysterious that I'm like, I want to know. And so just learning this little tiny thing is huge. I'm like, yes, please. And Askeladd's very serious. He's a very private person, which if he's coming from like mixed blood, and they're countries that have been at war with another, then that kind of would make sense, right? So it makes sense why he keeps things so private, but it makes him more fascinating. So yeah, and the fact that none of his men know what he just did is huge. They're like, we don't know why he went to talk to this fisherman, and he doesn't reveal it till later on. I'm glad that the ear is still alive. I thought he died way back when. So I'm glad that he's still alive, unless this is just a new ear that they've just found, but I think it's the same one. And Bjorn is interesting because he's kind of like the second in charge at this point, right? So we're going to put Bjorn over here. All right. Bjorn is basically the second in command when Askeladd is too busy. So he's kind of overseeing everything too, right? And then Ragnar, God, being like looking for Askeladd. I love they call him Conehead. I'm like, that's actually really hilarious that he has this nickname already. And the ear is saying, just make him shut up. We're not supposed to make noise while the ear is at work. And saying, can you make him be quiet? Because he can hear the horses coming. I like his Bjorn. Don't let that Conehead breathe. And so they ask what the status is, and they say that they've gotten closer. They're only a day behind. That they're going to catch up within a few days, and that there's 500 of them, and they're close behind us. Which would make sense that he could hear them, even though it's kind of fantastical that his hearing is that good. It's kind of like that's this little fantasy element of it. But it would make sense because if you've got 500 men marching on horse, then yeah, that would make a lot of rumbling. That would make sense, right? And Bjorn's like, oh God, they're closing in. They were 2 days away. And he's like, I know what I heard. They're closer. And Askeladd doesn't seem surprised, right? Askeladd knows that they're marching fast. So we've got on this one hand, Thorkell. Thorkell, his men are riled up and marching fast. They have a mission. They're like, we want to get that prince back. We're riled up. Thorkell ain't even moving. He's on the cart. You don't have to worry about it. But his men are all riled up. Meanwhile, you have Askeladd, whose men are kind of on the run. They don't really have a mission that they are pursuing. They are the pursuants. So they're being chased. So it's kind of something that they're not used to. Usually Askeladd's men are like gung-ho and they have a mission of their own. But here, they're just running away. So they really don't have any motivation. It's funny because they don't really have any motivation. They normally want to fight Thorkell. But Askeladd's like, nope, that's a bad idea. We've got the prince with us. We can't afford that. We need to get away and get him back. He's our bargaining chip. We can't lose the bargaining chip. So he's like, we need to escape from Thorkell and get out of his grasp, which is why he sent the letter. But for his men, this is a scenario that they're not used to. They're used to being like the ones to take charge and like go in and pillage and plunder, but not be the ones on the run. So the morale shift and the dynamic is totally different. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But that's when the ear hears the two horses. So Thorkell had sent a scout or two to go and listen to them, and they know exactly where they are. So yeah, they've ousted themselves. They're within range. Things are not looking good. Seeing the two horses run back. Yeah, and Askeladd's like, well, they've got us now. And so Ragnar's like, what do we do? If we're going to meet them in battle, we got to... Ragnar's prepared for a battle. Ragnar's like, hey, should we prepare to fight them? And of course, Askeladd's like, oh, hell no, we'll lose. Like, that's not going to work. We are in no shape. So Ragnar is prepared to fight. That's good to know. Ragnar doesn't want to fight, but it's nice to know that Ragnar is preparing for the worst case scenario. It's interesting because just Askeladd and Ragnar both seem like they can assess the situations pretty evenly. Askeladd is like over here trying to play chess though and work around it, whereas Ragnar is like putting up a defense, being like, okay, what happens if we can't... Ragnar's prepared to be cornered. And Askeladd's like, we're not getting cornered. That's kind of the differences in their personalities. Ragnar seems a little bit more pessimistic and kind of like resigned to the fact that they're going to get caught and we need to just be ready to fight. Askeladd's like, there's a way out. So I like that Askeladd's crafty like that. He's cunning. He's like, nah, if we don't need to fight them, we shouldn't. And Askeladd's like, that's impossible. We're no match for them. Yeah, just the fact of their men alone, their men's morale is pretty weak right now. Askeladd's like, we ain't going to last. So he's like, no. And Ragnar's like, well, if we don't do anything. And he's like, I've sent a request for reinforcements. We'll keep running until they arrive. And Bjorn's like, we didn't talk about this. So yeah, that's interesting because Bjorn seems under the impression that he's on the up and up of whatever Askeladd's planning. And here Askeladd's kind of admitting that, no, I'm kind of taking things into my own hands. So sorry, I had to do this, because Bjorn seems quite stunned that Askeladd's doing something without running it by his men or by Bjorn. And he looks across the river to Wales. I'm so fascinated. I love it. So it's November, downstream. It's November, winter is coming, and our guys are getting cranky. And so like we're deep in enemy territory. That's what Askeladd said. He's never lied to us like something about that before. He's like, you're right, Askeladd's never lied. But where's the closest fort? And they're like, it's Leicester. And they're like, that takes 2 weeks. We'll never make it. And they're like, I wonder if reinforcements will be here in time. And so all the men are kind of wondering. They're like, well, wait a minute. Like, they're all thinking the same thing. They're thinking that Askeladd contacted the main army to get them to send reinforcements. And so they're like, well, it's going to take 2 weeks for us to get the reinforcements. They're like, how's that going to work? They're like, we're going to have to split the plunder. Why would the boss do that? Why would Askeladd make it to where we're going to split the plunder? That was the whole point of kidnapping Canute, was that so we could get all the treasure and not have to split it with anybody else, like Thorkell. So it's interesting to see them kind of be like, thinking about why Askeladd's doing this, saying Askeladd said we could just handle it ourselves with just 100 of us. Did he lie? He's never lied before. And then meanwhile, towards the back of the line, you have people being like, I'm so tired. I just want to get back on a ship. Yeah. So a ship would be nice. So these men, knowing what we know about them, they are, and I'll put this kind of under Bjorn's thing, is that the men's morale is low. It's low. They're unsure and exhausted. Like, it was noted in a previous episode. Somebody noted in a previous episode, maybe it was even that general way back in episode 7, saying that they're pirates. They'll get weakened on land. They're not made for land combat. They're meant to sail on a ship, show up at the village, pillage and plunder, get all their stuff, and go back on the ship and rest up. Like, they're just there to, like, they have their stamina, but it's limited. And now that they're marching on land for days and days and days, they're not used to that. So it's starting to weaken them. And they don't have a clear-cut goal. They don't have, like, a rallying cry. They don't have something they're pursuing. So they're just all kind of uncertain. And they're starting to kind of get, like, antsy around Askeladd, which I'm sure Askeladd's like, we need to get these guys here to get us on a boat and get us out of here. So that's very curious. I didn't know where Thorfinn was not present for most of this episode, which is fascinating to me. I thought at this point that Askeladd had sent him and Canute away. I thought that since we cut from Canute revealing himself to not being seen at all, but we did see Ragnar. So I thought that originally, like, Thorfinn was, like, taking Canute aside, like, on a different route so that they wouldn't be targeted if Thorkell caught up with them. That's kind of where I thought it was going. But the moment we saw Ragnar, I was like, well, that can't be, because Ragnar isn't going anywhere without Canute. He's like, they're attached at the hip. And so I was really curious to know where Thorfinn was in all this, but it was just the creator saying, Thorfinn's not needed. His edginess is not needed. This is more of an Askeladd-centered episode, which is fascinating. Very much so. So we've got all of our soldiers lying about sleeping. Meanwhile, Askeladd is looking through what looks like a map. Looks like he's looking at a map, trying to think of where they're going to go. And now that we know what we know about the episode, we know that Askeladd was looking at the map and figuring out, okay, how do we get to Gainsborough through Wales? How do we trudge up through there? What can we do? Again, our boy Askeladd, he is a chess player. Not in the literal sense of the word, but he is thinking ahead. He is thinking about what can be done. What do I need to do to accomplish my goal? It's like, it's a reason why I love his character so much. He's like, he just has that personality that you get magnetized towards, right? And then as soon as we saw a pair of boots, I was like, oh, it's Bjorn. Bjorn wants to know what's up. And he's like, what, do you need something? And Bjorn's like, you know our relationship is stronger than that. I don't ship anybody in this show. This is like the least romantic show I'm watching right now. It's like the least romantic. There's like no romance whatsoever, but there's almost like this, for the record, I do not ship Askeladd and Bjorn, but there's almost like this pseudo, like, parental relationship they have with Thorfinn. It's the most messed up thing. But when Bjorn shows back up, he's like, I thought we talked about this. I thought we shared each other's secrets. Like, it kind of has that attitude with it. So it's really funny, but there's like no romance in this show. No, not since episode 3 has there been any inkling of romance. Unless you consider Canute and Thorfinn the most unlikely BL possible. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, he's like, everyone's worried. He's like, you should give them an explanation. Like, you're not explaining yourself. What's going on? I want to get a picture of Askeladd's expression here, because he's just like, Askeladd, it's funny because we talked about contradictions. Askeladd seems like someone that he wants the respect of his men, but he knows it's for a purpose, right? He knows it's for a purpose. And here, he knows he's treading in dangerous waters because he's about to affiliate himself with basically someone that is not an acquaintance to them, someone that could be a potential enemy, but that Askeladd's tied to, and it's connecting something personal of Askeladd to their mission. So he's kind of hesitant and cautious about it. He doesn't want to give too much away, right? So that's interesting. And he doesn't answer Bjorn. He says, let them worry. It's like, worrying will make the march faster. He's like, let them worry. Let them get anxious. We'll just get there quicker. That way they're not satisfied. And Bjorn's like, that's not good enough. He's like, okay. And I love that he sits down next to the fire and just stares at Askeladd like, okay, you don't want to tell our soldiers anything? Fine. What about me? So yeah, Bjorn is kind of like, we should be talking to one another. So I like that he questions Askeladd and is like, come on, what's the deal? Why are you being weird? And he calls him out on it. And yeah, he's looking at a map. We can see from the other side that Askeladd's looking at a map of all the kingdoms and everything. He's like, what? If that's all, then go back to sleep. Leave me alone. I want to get an image of that. We have the two faces side by side, Bjorn and Askeladd. I want to get a picture of that because that's so fascinating. Where he's like, you've been acting weird. What are you up to? Like, we usually talk about this. What's the deal? And Askeladd's like, oh, And he said, ever since you saw the prince's face, right? This is where things get really interesting. He's like, Because, yeah, Askeladd had a pretty visceral reaction seeing the prince's face. He was like, oh, okay, so this is what he says in this conversation, and then what we see of Canute later on is contradictory and makes it very interesting. So I wanted to go back to this conversation and talk about what the deal is, because he kind of looks off in the distance. He's like, what do I say? How do I phrase this? And he says, I've been living among criminals for 40 years. So Askeladd, at the very least, is in his 50s. At the very least, right? So, because if he's like, he's either in his late 40s or early 50s at the least, because if he's been living among criminals for 40 years, he may even be 60. I don't know. If he's been doing that, it's like he'd have to at least have been a child or a teenager. I don't think he was born among criminals. He didn't say I was born among criminals. He said I've been living among them. So he probably was at least in his teens or early childhood. So he's at least in his late 40s, 50s. Okay, which makes the conversation with Thorfinn about how it's only a matter of time before you best me all the more. Which, a guy being in his 50s back then is a pretty big deal. Most of them didn't live that long, so that's kind of a big deal for him. Good for you, Askeladd. Good for you. And so he's like, I can tell what a man is like, whether he's a big shot or a nobody, whether he is smart or stupid by looking at his face. So Askeladd's gift is that he can know someone by looking at their face. He can instantly tell a man, which is fascinating, right? Because that means that he knows about Thorfinn, he knows about Thor's. We're gonna tie that to this. He can know by looking at their face, okay? And Bjorn just has this look on his face like, so what do you think about me? He's like, okay. And Askeladd's like, you're gonna make me talk more? Okay, fine. Fine, exposition no jutsu. When I saw the prince's face, I could tell. And we see Canute. We can see Canute with his little angelic face, with his little lips pursed. Canute is adorable. It's like, okay. So, but about Canute, he says, that's not the face of a king. All right. Not the face of a king. Interesting. But is that a bad thing or a good thing? That's the question, right? It's like, okay. And Bjorn's like, well, true. He looks like a girl. I love Bjorn's like, well, yeah, it looks like the face of a queen. Like, yeah. It's like, I get that. He's like, but he's still a kid, you know? Because so he said he's around the same age as Thorfinn. So Canute is around 17. Around 16 to 17. Okay. Much taller than Thorfinn. Poor Thorfinn, he's stuck with his height. Thor's a big man, so Helga. Was Helga's family short, maybe? And Askeladd, he's just like, that's true. He's still young. His future still awaits. Okay, so this is interesting. Askeladd saying that he's young. He's still young, and that his future awaits. And we'll talk about this. I'm like, Askeladd, when he talks about this like prophecy and stuff later, I'm like, you don't strike me as a spiritual man, Askeladd, so curiouser. He's like, so yeah, he's still got a future ahead of him. I'm like, what? And Bjorn's like, that's cryptic. What the heck are you saying? He's like, okay, time to go. And Bjorn's like, well, wait, talk to me more. No, he just instantly shuts off. He's like, yep, his future awaits. Guess we're gonna have to plan for that potential with him. I'm like, what? So there's a part that says, there's a part of me that wonders if Askeladd's like, I've seen the faces of kings in the past, and they're kind of full of shit. It's like, I don't like them. King Swin is just riding on his royalty when really he's like about to croak. He looks by the end of this episode like he's about to die. And so he's like, I've seen kings in the past and seen how they function. And he's like, I know how they work. This guy doesn't seem like that at all, which could be what Askeladd is thinking will usher in a new era for his people and for other countries as well. He's like, this guy looks like he has potential and that he could do something if he's molded the right way and makes certain decisions, right? So I feel like Askeladd sees potential in Canute, kind of like what he saw with Thorfinn, right? But there's a moment later on that I want to talk about, and we'll get to it, but we're just not there yet. So he wakes all the men up, and the men are like, oh, we barely slept. He's like, it's still dark. And he's like, nope, time to go. And Bjorn's like, something's up. So Bjorn is a bit worried, I feel. I feel like Bjorn has always been on the same page with Askeladd, even if they don't agree on things. And this is the first time that Bjorn's like, I really can't read Askeladd. And I don't think Bjorn likes the fact that Askeladd is keeping things from him, because their relationship seems like one that's not happened with before. So he's like, you can tell he's not happy about it. So they keep marching onwards. And so you can just tell looking at them that they're all just exhausted. Like their body language, they're all just slumped over. They don't even go after the deer. Like there's a giant buck there and they just completely ignore it. They're like so worried about it. And it shows them like pushing the wagon through the mud and the rain and pulling the horses. Like they're just exhausted, right? And you see like the visual imagery, they're shadows of themselves. They're just shells of what they were at the start of this journey. They're so tired. And so then, and we see like the rain and everything and the tents, like it's all makeshift. They're just all just wanting, they don't know what's going to happen next. Okay. And so Askeladd though keeps marching, and that's when the ear hears like the fog is thick. And he's like, hey, were you able to sleep? And the guy is like, no. Like they're just so tired. He's like, hey. And he's like, shut up, be quiet. He's like, no, if I'm quiet, I'll fall asleep. And just like the trees and everything all just swirling around them. Like you can just feel the exhaustion from all of them. And the ear's like, this is bad. They're right behind us. Like at this point, the ear, his eyes aren't even open. He's just like, he can hear it. And he's like, they're right behind us. We need to do something. And Askeladd's like, yeah, I know. And Bjorn's like, they're going to catch up. What are we going to do? And he says, I said, I know. We're almost to where the reinforcements will come right there. So clearly Askeladd, he gave them a specific time to show up. And he's like, I know when they're going to arrive. We just have to make it there on time. And we'll be able to get away from Thorkell and his men. And that's why he pushed the men to get up early and keep marching. Even though he knew it was going to exhaust him. He's like, no, we got to keep going. And that's when we get to where the mist is. And this dock, this very, very ancient looking dock is so fascinating. I like the idea with the columns and everything. Like in episode 10, when Askeladd was talking about Thorfinn, this adds another layer to it, right? It adds another layer. So it could be, we're talking about preservation. The preservation of his people. Here's the thing, if Askeladd is tied to Wales, which I think he is, then that lecture he gives to Thorfinn about how there's always going to be someone come up and try to take over and usurp the land from the people before it. You can tell, like, by the armor and the way that their outfits are designed, that the Welsh people here have taken inspiration from the Romans, right? Which, when we get our little history lesson later on, we learned that they were once occupied by the Romans. That culture has lingered. Like, the columns and stuff at the dock is a reminder of that Roman influence. It's still there. And that ties to Askeladd being fascinated by the Romans and by the fall of the Roman Empire, and how it ties to Wales, to possibly his mother's people. And so it also ties to the fact that maybe he sees Canute as a means of helping to preserve his mother's people, because the whole thing is that they want a treaty so that the King of England, if Canute becomes the King of England as well as Denmark, he's like, you need to promise us you're gonna leave us alone and let us have our own affairs. You're not gonna try to take over us like the Romans did before we came along, and so far and so forth. So that's interesting. We're getting like little bits and pieces with Askeladd and that. But these guys showing up, he's like, there's just the two of them, these reinforcements. I thought it was going to be like just, and Bjorn's like, maybe it's just an illusion made by the fog. I thought it was going to be like a whole fleet. Like, there was a big ship, so it was kind of half right. But I thought it was going to be like a big army there to help them. But no, they're there to cross the river, to just completely get away from Thorkell. Like, he can't follow us if we've sailed away, you know? So that's fun. But yeah, Askeladd. And you can tell by his clothing and his armor, he goes ahead. And these elders, yeah, so these guys seem like I wonder if they're around the same age, because when he said elders, they technically would be the elders at that point, right? Because, you know, back then people didn't live to be probably over 60 or 70. And him bowing before them, I'm honored that the commander himself has come. And this guy looks freaking terrifying. Like, this man, he's like, it's been a long time, Askeladd. And he signals the ship to know that it was him. Wow. Okay. So I'm curious how they all know each other. We'll probably never find that out. But I'm so curious. The big ship with the eyes on it. And so, yeah, him showing the armor. It's the exact same armor like he has. The breastplate and everything. And even the sleeves of Askeladd's outfit kind of look similar. Okay. So they cross the river. And Thorkell, I like these, like, well, damn. He's like, a ship carried him across. Well, that cheeky bastard, how dare he? And there's, do you know whose ship? And they're like, we're not sure. The fog was as thick as goat's milk. I love that description. It wasn't a Norse ship. It didn't have a dragon head. It was bulkier. It was pudgy. A pudgy ship. I like that description. Had an eye on the bow. Big like this. And he's like, oh, that doesn't sound like one of King Swin's ships. Interesting. So, there's a couple things from this conversation. One, it reminded me of Floki, because Floki, the axes and stuff have an eye on it, but the eye is different than the one for Wales. It's a different type of eye. The eye that's been on the axes and stuff looks a bit different. But also, in this conversation, Thorkell says, well, in that case, we can't follow Thorfinn anymore. I love that he doesn't care about anything else but Thorfinn. He just wants to fight Thorfinn. He's like, well, I want to talk more with Thor's son. Damn it. He's like, well, how are we going to manage this? I thought by the end of this episode that he found a way to go track down and figure out where... He says I underestimated them, which I do think Thorkell's smart. I think that he's kind of meatheaded, but he's smart. He's not an idiot. So I figured by the end of the episode that Thorkell sent someone to go find a scout to figure out where they ended up going. He sent somebody on ahead to figure out what was happening, or he sent a message of his own. One of the things, he's like, I didn't think that the people across the Severn River were their allies. That's the thing. They're not. But for Askeladd, they'll make an exception. He's like, does that mean that people across the river switch sides from England to Denmark? And Thorkell's like, do you not know anything? No. He's like, let me give you, I want Thorkell to have like a side series where Thorkell explains British history or European history, not British necessarily, but I want him to explain European history. I'm like, can it be in Thorkell's voice actor? Can he like have like a little whiteboard coon of his own and a wand, and he just like points to the board and the map and like explains things? I would honestly play Akio Otsuka, who's his voice actor. I'd pay him money to do that. That'd be great. He's like, the land on the other side of the river isn't part of England in the first place. It's Wales. And I've been spelling it. I couldn't decide. I was like, is it Wales with an H or not an H? Not the animal Wales. It's Wales without the H. I was like, was I right at first? Because I wrote it without an A. You know when you write something and you think that doesn't sound right and you're like, that seems weird. Yeah, I wrote it right that time, and then ever since then I've been incorrect. I'm off duty. But yeah, so this part is like Wales is a mountainous region west of England. So this part's interesting because of the way they describe it, and it tying to Askeladd and Thorfinn, saying that it's mountainous, but it's not good for agriculture. It has steep mountains with few natural resources. The flat land suitable for agriculture was scarce. The land was poor compared to England. So here's the thing. That sounds an awful lot like Iceland. So that sounds like it's tying, and I'm going to do my little wavy line over here, to Thorfinn. In that it's tying to that Askeladd may have grown up in a similar environment. Again, we don't know. We don't know if Askeladd grew up in Wales. We don't know if he grew up in Denmark and just visited Wales. We don't know. But the way that they describe Wales is very similar to Iceland. It doesn't have a lot of natural resources. It's a pretty harsh environment. It's not great for growing things, but the people there make do the best that they can. So his background, if he's from Wales, sounds similar to Thorfinn's. So that's interesting. But we got our map here. We have Gwynedd, we've got Rufonoig, and God, saying these in Old English is going to be like, ugh. Aquasulix, Wessex, Bristol, the Bristol Channel, Morganwig. Morganwig, I'm like, is that right, Morganwig? And then the whole Bryshinog, I'm like, oh my gosh, all with the O and I's and the G's, and Dyfed and Bult and Mercia and Cambria. I'm like, so they've just crossed over from Wessex over into Morganwig. Okay, and I've probably said that wrong, and so I apologize. After the rule ended with the Roman Empire, Wales was never unified under a single country. They were just instead divided into many small rival kingdoms for hundreds of years. So they've never really had a single country of their own. They've just been kind of bolstered around and jostled around between different rules. And so Askeladd's request was answered by one of those small kingdoms, Morganwig. Okay. So east of Morganwig Kingdom, Wales. Mm-hmm. And so Ragnar's just like, hey, works for us. We don't care how we got here, that we're in enemy territory. We're not in a land occupied at all by Denmark. Like, just getting us away from Thorkell is enough. And the priest is over there, like, stuffing his face with booze. And so I don't think Thorkell's clenching his teeth in anger. I think Thorkell's just like, I guess we'll find another way. But poor Canute. Canute looks really just apathetic about it all. He's like, we need to return to Gainsborough. And he's like, look at all these ships we could get. And Askeladd's like, no, we're going by land. And this part where he says, no, we're going by land. And he's like, why? He's like, what are you talking about? There's a ship right there. Why don't we take it? And he says, don't look at the perspective of a large nation. He says, for this country, even 3 warships are a valuable asset. See, talk about contradictions, right? Talk about contradictions. Askeladd is a man who has gone to many countries and pillaged and plundered and took their resources without question at all. Just was like, opportunist, take it and go, don't care. And so, yeah, you could argue that his men are not in fighting condition, They just got on the ship. You could argue that's a big reason. We don't know how many people are in Morganwood there. We don't know how many people are in Wales that could fight them. Maybe Askeladd sees it as a losing battle and that there's no point. We'll just go on land and get there ourselves. But the fact that he said, even for this country, 3 warships are a valuable asset, it's kind of like he's standing up for Wales. He's standing up for them, saying, they've only got 3 warships. We can't take their warships. I'm like, what Askeladd in previous episodes would have been okay? The fact that they only have 3 warships, I'm like, then take one. Tell them you want one. Why are you being so not opportunist when you're in this country? Is it because that you're from here and you know these men that run it and you're like, we need their help? Probably. And we need their help, so we need to stay on their good side, and pillaging and plundering this village is kind of out of the question. It's just so fascinating that this is the one place he's like, nah, we don't need to do this. And he's very reverent and respectful here. And I'm like, okay, Askeladd, you mysterious man. Very curious. He's like, we have to be thankful that they helped us to escape from Thorkell in the first place. I'm like, that's the thing too. Even though, yeah, Askeladd has shown gratitude for others in the past, he's always still had an angle to it. When he was at his uncle's in Denmark, there was an angle to it, right? He was still had an angle that he was seeking. He was grateful that his uncle gave him a place to come to, and thankful that he was giving him food and shelter, but there was still an agenda to it. There was an angle behind it that Askeladd was pursuing. Here, he's very different. His personality shifts a lot. So I'm like, this is very curious. I'm like, was the blonde woman in his vision before? Was it not Hordaland? Was it his mother? We don't know, right? Was it Lydia? I don't know. I'm so curious now. And he's like, then we can make do with only 2 ships. We can all fit. And Askeladd's like, you're missing the point. He's like, no, if you keep acting selfish, I'm going to leave you behind. And Bjorn's just kind of like, okay, whatever. And so he's like, are you telling me to walk across Wales? That's ridiculous. He's like, the people in this land hate us. And he's like, well, they're going to hate us a lot more if we steal a ship. And so Askeladd's probably like, no, we're going to get help from these guys that know me. He's like, I can't allow you to endanger His Highness any further. So this is interesting. It's like we have a little Falco moment with Canute here. Him seeing the hawk and saying, a hawk. And he's like, it's so low. And he's like, Ragnar, catch it. And Ragnar's like, what, right now? Like, right at this moment? He's like, pardon me, we're in the middle of something important, Your Highness. Like, excuse me. That's so, at that point I was like, wait, what? I figured that Canute would just catch it himself, but no, he's like, tells Ragnar to catch it. He wants his own hawk. I'm like, Canute is baffling to me at this point. And again, he's a mystery box. And I'm going to be curious to kind of unpack him and see, like, is he the Arthur for Arthurian legend? Is he going to pull the sword from the stone? Is that where we're going with this? If it is, I'm all for it. But I don't want it confirmed yet. I want it to be a surprise. And he's like, yeah. He's like, Askeladd's just like, well, that was weird. He's like, it's better than moving north through England with Thorkell at our heels. It's like, we can either take the long way around and just kind of avoid Thorkell until we get to Gainsborough and get some reinforcements from the king, or we can go back to England and probably get killed. He's like, he's like, we know we're going to get attacked by Thorkell if we go back to England. We don't know if we're going to get attacked by Wales if we stay here. So let's go with the uncertainty more than the certainty, because the certainty seems pretty bad. It's so fascinating. He's like, anyway, this country is an ally of mine. And Ragnar's like, yeah, okay, if you're still worried. He's like, Thorfinn, where have you been this entire episode? We've gone through like 3/4 of the episode without you here. So, yeah, Wales is an ally. And that's all he says. That's all he gives us. I'm like, okay, Askeladd. So then Thorfinn shows up. He's been here this whole time, just been brooding off screen. And him hands on his hips, he's like, I'll assign him to guard Canute. And Ragnar's like, oh yeah, you're that guy from back then. Ragnar doesn't seem to mind, because Ragnar's probably like, oh yeah, this kid, he's short, but he can kill a bunch of people, so on board with it. Totally fine. And then, he's like, Thorfinn's like, why do I have to watch over this pretty boy? He's like, he's small, but he's good. Like, Askeladd just ignores him. He's the same age as His Highness. I'm sure they'll get along. At that point, I was like, wow. So Thorfinn's just going to get charged with Canute. I was like, are you setting me up? Are you setting me up to ship this unlikely relationship? He's like, say your greetings, Thorfinn. It's like the introduction of any series. Like, say hello. And he's just like introducing him like he's a dog. And I like that Thorfinn... his pouty face. I'm gonna put it up there because it needs to be. God, it's like it's almost like if Askeladd was a matchmaker. He's like, okay, Thorfinn, here's your blind date, and that was the face you made. Like, you ain't impressing the ladies with that face. And I love that Canute is like. I love that Canute's like, oh my God, what a scary kid, and just hides behind Ragnar. Ragnar's like, so it's so fascinating, like, but he seems cowardly. He seems cowardly and weak. But maybe Askeladd just sees potential. He's like, no, he may seem cowardly and weak, but there's something there. Askeladd's like, I see something. It's just not present yet. He's like, he's young. He has a chance to prove himself. Like something. He saw something in Canute, and we're gonna talk about it here in just a minute. He's like, are you an idiot? What are you glaring at him for? And Bjorn, I just want this picture of the three of them. It's like, Askeladd's like, why are you glaring at him? Be nice. Make a friend, Thorfinn. And Bjorn's in the back like Askeladd and Bjorn look like two parents who are trying to help their kid make friends. And it's the most messed up pseudo-parental relationship at all, right? It's so messed up. But at this point, I'm like, what do we do? And Bjorn just laughing like, oh my God. He's like, are you going to reward me for this? Thorfinn didn't come here to make friends. He came here to kill Askeladd. And so he's asking Askeladd, he's like, if I watch over this prince, are you going to duel me? Am I going to get my reward? Is this dog going to get a bone? And he's like, fine. If we get to Gainsborough, I'll duel you. Famous last words, right? And so then the guys come. He said, yeah, we're finished. We're so busy. And so these guys, he's like, this is Gracianus, the general. He has just like a hard, stoic look like Askeladd does. He's going to show us the way. And interestingly enough, Gracianus, or Gratianus, however you want to say his name, the general, I'll just call him the general, he assumes that Thorfinn is the prince. It's funny that the general of Wales, thinks that Thorfinn is the prince. He says, you have a threatening look about you and you have a good face. So he's like, you're kind of handsome, I guess. You kind of look like a little dog gremlin, but you're handsome enough. I could see you being from royalty. Which Helga was beautiful, and she was a general's daughter, so genetics, right? He's like, you look like you could be a prince. Okay. And Askeladd's like, oh, no. He's like, no, that's one of my men. He is not allowed near the nice furniture. No. No, the prince is over there. Prince Canute is there, hiding behind that man with the cone head, stroking his hair. And he's like, like he's just so, he goes, his eyes look weak. Is he really going to be the next ruler of England? And Ragnar's like, you bastard, how rude. And he's like, no, look, the only reason we're helping the Danish prince escape is so that he will become king and help us. We want a treaty of non-aggression. He's like, we want our people spared. He's like, it's all up to you, prince. He's like, look, we're only helping you because this kid, if he becomes Prince of Denmark, King of Denmark, and then they take over England and he becomes King of England too, we want y'all to leave us alone. So he asks Canute if he will swear to not, once you become King of England, that you won't interfere in the matters of Wales. It's like, we want to be our own people. We're tired of having the rule of us jostled around these other countries. Will you let us be our own independent nation and leave us alone? And this is fascinating because Canute doesn't speak for himself. There's a part of this that's like, Canute's been conditioned to not speak for himself. he's always had Ragnar speak for him or had someone else speak for him. Canute has never been one that, from what we can tell, Canute doesn't seem to have a lot of confidence in himself, and he's one that's not been allowed to have a voice. So he always relies on others to speak for him. And the general doesn't like that. He's like, no, I asked you to speak. He's like, and Askeladd, it's funny that Askeladd's watching like, like how's he going to handle this? And he tells him that they want the ships. And Ragnar's like, yes, leave it to me. So, well, and that's the thing. I wonder if Canute actually did tell Ragnar that, or if Canute was like, can you just like work with them? I don't know what to say. If maybe he said that and Ragnar's like, leave it to me. I've got it. And he asked for the ships. I want to see his reaction. He's like, His Highness says that if you give us 3 ships, and he's like, no. I asked the prince to speak, not you. So I'm thinking that Canute did not want the ships, but that Canute was like, can you take care of this? I don't know what to say. And Ragnar's like, I got this. And that's when he asked for the 3 ships. And the general's like, no, I want the prince to speak for himself. And he's like, what? And then Canute's like, I don't know what to say. And Askeladd's just like, He's like, never mind. I'll ask again later. And he comes prepared, though. The general's like, I'll ask again later. And in the meantime, I'm going to write up a document that you can sign so that if you don't want to verbally amend the document, this is what we're going to sign into writing, this treaty of non-aggression, and you'll just have to go along with it. So I just wanted to hear it from your mouth, but I guess maybe if you'll let me boss you around, sure, we'll go with it. Canute's fascinating, y'all. He is a mystery box, for sure. And Ragnar doesn't like the fact that he's been ignored. He's like, excuse me? You just ignored us, you arrogant snob. And I'm like, he's not really arrogant. That's the thing. He's like, you're taking advantage of us. I'm like, no, you wouldn't speak. Your prince wouldn't speak for himself. He's going to be the leader of a nation, but yet he's having you do his dirty work. I'm like, I feel like the people of Wales, they don't, the general there, it's not how he functions. And Canute just sitting there looking at his hair. Does he think he's an equal to the prince? Yes, very much so. That's why he was trying to get a handle on Canute. He does seem, he probably thinks he's better than the prince at this point, to be honest, because the prince can't speak for himself. That's fascinating. And then Askeladd's like, he looks at Canute and he just goes, I just want to know what he's thinking. And we get a little bit more with that later. So our guys are marching on. They keep marching, and then the one guy's like, marching. Now we're marching in the mountains. All we do is go. And he's like, well, the mountains are better than Thorkell. So they're all talking about here and trying to pass the time, which if you think about it, there's no phones, there's no books, there's nothing. It's just all oral tradition at this point. And this is kind of a cool, fascinating thing about this culture is that there's lots of these guys, they can't read probably, so they pass on everything through word of mouth and through stories. And so they're trying to pass the time. And so they're thinking about how things are a lot better than fighting Thorkell. He's like, let's talk about something more fun. And he's like what? He's like, well, our reward from King Swin. So it's easy to see how things get exaggerated in this situation because they're all like talking about, okay, what are we going to give? We saved the prince from Thorkell. We did that. And one guy's like, I want a farm. And the guy's like, I want a cool sword. I'm like, the guy with the sword probably is the most realistic goal. I'm like, I doubt the king's going to give you an entire farm for saving the prince. He's like, it's all about gold. Nothing's better than gold. So the one guy's like, I just want the money. And then this guy's like, I heard the king has 100 beautiful slave women from around the world in his bedroom. And so we see like all of these different women, like from all different cultures. And the one guy's like, he just wants one of the women, right? And that's when they ask the priest. They say, you've been to the palace, right? What does the king have in his house? And this is so amazing because I love this conversation that happens here with the priest, Willibald. He says, there was nothing of value in particular. Just, there's nothing there of value, which we've seen the tents that the king has surrounding him as they go from place to place. The tents aren't very elaborate. There's nothing great about the tents. There's not women hanging off him all over the place. There's just soldiers there protecting him because he's the king. But that's it. I'm like, yeah, the priest is just telling the truth. He's like, no, you guys think he's got all this amazing stuff. He's like, no, there's nothing really there. Nothing of value. It's just It's kind of like, it's almost making a commentary that it's all a big facade. It's all a facade. The king and everything, there's nothing special to it. It's just all what you perceive and what is being put out there for perception. And he's like, there's not really anything there. He's a king by birthright, and that's pretty much it. Mm-hmm. And they're like, not even beautiful women? And he's like, well, he did have a lot of slave women. He's like, I won't deny you that. And so they're like, well, what? Are you not interested? Like, why didn't you say they were beautiful or something? And I like that the priest, they're like, don't you like women? And I was thinking they were going a different direction with it, but then he's like, no. He says, gold, silver, and beautiful women are all nothing compared to the thing that I seek, as he drinks his booze. And of course, their curiosity's piqued at this point. And he's like, well, then what are you seeking? Tell us. And it's something so simple. He says, I'm seeking love. And they're like, what's love? I like the fact that these Vikings don't know what that is. Like, it's not in their language, which is not totally ununderstandable, because there's lots of words that across language barriers don't have meaning. Like, there's words that, have meanings in certain languages that are not able to be translated into others, right? So that's curious, but they're like, what's love? And so he's like, I've never heard of it. And he goes, and then they say it's a spell that the Christians are always chanting. I'm like, oh my God, saying that love is a spell? But for them, for these Vikings, everything is so superficial, and it's all like surface level and immediate. And it's just, they move on from one thing to another. And with the line of work that they do, yeah, you wouldn't really, love isn't something really on the table, right? It's not something that they would need to have moving from thing to thing, and with the materialism that they have, it kind of goes against it, right? And so they're like, well, is it some kind of food? That one guy's like Goku off Dragon Ball Z. He's like, is love a kind of food? Like when Goku got, persuaded into being married to Chi-Chi because he thought marriage was a food. It's like, and they're like, well, how many pounds in silver is love? Like, is it valuable? And he's like, no, it can't be measured in silver, because love is what gives value to silver. He says, without love, gold, silver, and beautiful women are all worthless. Which is like, I was like, oh, we're getting deep and philosophical here. Because yeah, that's true. Like anything that we own, like for me, Whiteboard Coon is invaluable because he helps me. And I love Whiteboard Coon because it helps me do things. But to somebody else, they might be like, oh, it's a piece of junk, get rid of it. They don't love it, doesn't have worth to them. And so the concept that in order to value something, you have to love it, it's so true. I mean, that's the whole thing with why we buy things, why we get, if you're in a fandom, why do you buy a figurine of something? Well, because you love that series and you love the character, and so you attach value to it. And so that's so fascinating. And these guys are like, gives value? That doesn't make sense. They're like, silver has the value of silver. Don't make it so difficult. They're like, why are you making things difficult? Things are the way that they are. There's no abstract meaning to it. I like that they try to be so concrete and pragmatic. And the priest is adding this layer of something deeper, this layer of meaning, something symbolic, this layer of an understanding beyond just the surface. And a lot of these Vikings are like, no, we're not ready for that. But they're like, he's bluffing. Just ignore him. But then this one guy, and he goes back to drink his beer, to drink his ale, and he's like, hey, priest. And he says, keep talking. I want to hear more. I got chills. Listen to that, because it's like, yeah, that's the whole thing. They're marching through the mountains. They have nothing else to do but hear stories from one another. And this one guy's like, no, I want to hear more. Like, talk more about this love. So I'm like, it's kind of like you could see how this religion, how Christianity in this culture has spread, because there are guys like that one soldier that they want to know more. They're like, no, come on, keep talking. Like, they find a connection to it. They resonate with it. And the priest is like, okay. So you can see the seeds being planted with this scene. Oh, it's so good. But yeah, just the seeds being planted, and the priest maybe having a connection with some of these soldiers. Like, you can see it starting, right? I'm all about it. I love it. And the idea that the priest is trying to find some sense of purpose, some sense of value to what he's doing. And that's why he wants to seek love. It's like, oh, I absolutely love that scene. It's so great. So the kingdom of Barshinog. I'm going to have to look this up. I'm going to look up what these towns mean, how you pronounce them before we move forward to episode 13. I'm going to look them up because I was like, I'm literally the worst at pronouncing in general. And so now you give me a bunch of old English names and I'm like, He's like, don't worry. I've talked to them already. He's like, thank you for your help. And he says, we're not doing this for you. It's just that our interests are aligned. So the general's like, so the general knows Askeladd, but he's like, I'm not doing it for you. But if helping you gets Canute to become king, and Canute becoming king gets us our own independence, then it's worth it. So he's like, we're only, enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so he's like, no, that's the only reason we're helping you. And then he says, the Welsh kingdoms have always been threatened by invasions from England. If you Danes can make them stop, then it would be good for us. So he says, you Danes. So he does not recognize Askeladd as one of their own. He doesn't recognize Askeladd as one of his own, which makes me think that maybe Lydia was someone that they knew from Wales, that she was someone that their village knew, that their kingdom knew, and she got married to Askeladd's father, who was a Dane, and then he was raised in Denmark and maybe visited Wales with his mother, and that's how he knew the people there. Or he came after his mother died, maybe, and that's how he knew the people there. Again, Askeladd is such a mystery, and I want to know more, but it's fascinating, right? And so he's like, I'm sure His Highness the Prince will promise you that, like what you want. And I like that he says, he looks back at Canute, who is just really quiet there. He's like, so is that your king, Askeladd? And he's like, he's from a good bloodline. As for the rest, I have high hopes for him since he's young. That whole since he's young, he keeps coming back to that. Since he's young. It's fascinating. He keeps tying back to that line, right? He's like, I have high hopes for him since he's young. He's impressionable. He can be molded in certain ways. He has a long future ahead of him. I'm like, So he seems like he has potential. I'm curious because from the outset, what we've seen of Canute so far, he looks like the opposite of anybody Askeladd would have any faith in, right? He looks like the opposite of that, right? So I don't know if Askeladd, the only thing I can think of is that Askeladd thinks he can use Canute and he can mold him a certain way and exploit him, but it seems like there's more to it than that. It's not like, because with Thorfinn, he's like, I know how to use Thorfinn. I've got him under my thumb. I know how to use him. But with Canute, it seems different than that. Even though you would think the same would apply, he thinks he can use Canute. But he thinks more than that. It's fascinating. And so then he sees Thor's. That's the thing. So, okay. That's what I wanted to come back to. Is the idea with Thor's that does he see Canute having the same principles as did Canute have the same look on his face that Thor's did? When he read Thor's, he saw a certain something in Thor's that he sees in Canute, right? So the thing of it is, with Thor's was older and had ties with other guys and had been charged to be executed, so his time was up. But Canute is young and in a much better place than Thor's was. Thor's, was considered a traitor by his people and Floki had charged him to be killed either way. But Canute is a prince. So by all intents and purposes, Canute should have the kingdom handed to him on a silver platter from his father. So maybe Askeladd saw the same thing in Canute that he saw in Thor's, the same expression, the same presence, and thought, okay, you have a much different chance than Thor's did. Thor's days were numbered. You have a bright future. You have the life ahead of you that could allow you to live out an ideal like Thor's had, only to the fullest extent, and maybe influence others around you. Like Thor's wasn't able to influence anybody because he was just one person and he didn't have a following or any type of way to make his ideals become a reality. other than to his son, who is ignoring him. But with Canute could lead a people and cause a cultural shift that Thors was never able to make happen. So that's curious. And again, the fact that Thorfinn is entitled, that makes me wonder if the reason why he charged Thorfinn to be alongside Canute is maybe knowing that Thorfinn, once he hears Canute talk maybe about those ideals, will connect Canute to his father, and that will spur Thorfinn to want to protect him more. I don't know. But I feel like at some point Thorfinn is going to have that conversation with Canute and is going to realize that Canute's ideals maybe are in line with his father's. And we've talked about that in the last episode when they were praying, in the episode before when they were praying in the tent. So, I don't know. It's leaving a lot. There's a lot of things under the surface at work. And so then after that vision, he says, the more you fall for a man, the less things go how you want. Which is curious. So that I'm like, so Askeladd fell for Thors, basically. And not like in a romantic sense at all. Again, I'm not trying to make this a BL. I swear I'm not trying to make it a BL. But I think that Askeladd did kind of fall for Thors in that what he saw of him as a warrior. He's like, no, you're the ideal person that one could strive to be. Someone that is fierce like a warrior, but has honor and dignity, and strives to do more than just cause bloodshed. Like there's an honorable side to you that not a lot of warriors have. And he sees that same side in Canute. But like he said, Askeladd's like, the more you fall for a man, the less things go how you want. Meaning like I had all these ambitions and hopes with Thors, and things did not go the way I want. He died. And so he's like, I don't want to put too much faith in Canute because I don't want to get too invested in him, because then if things go south, then he's like, I'm going to end up being disappointed, right? Or I'm going to end up, things are going to fall apart, right? If I put too much faith in them. Maybe someone like him is just what we need. Maybe it's something to shake it up. Something like him that's going to be different to shake things up. And what is such a weird contradiction, because he's like talking about all the potential that Canute has and how Canute could be this great figure, or could be somebody that can change things for Denmark. And then you cut to him and he's just sitting there stroking his hair, looking like, he looks like the son in Monty Python that's like, I just have a song to sing. And he's like, no, none of that. Ragnar comes in, he's like, no, we're not singing here. You know, he just has that kind of weak look about him. But I'm like, is it all an act? Is it all hiding like his true potential? I don't know. Askeladd seems to think so. And so then the general says, we are the descendants of Britannia. He says, we're not going to follow the king of the Danes. It's like, no, we're not going to follow him. He's like, and then he tells the general, he's like, do you believe in the legend? Do you still believe in the legend? The legend that Artorius will return from Avalon to the west and restore the Britannia of old. So does he think that Canute is Arthur? Does he think that Canute is Arthur? Because he's like, look, he's like, you know, maybe Canute isn't what we thought of, but maybe, you know, he may become the king of Denmark. But what if he comes to Avalon, from Avalon, like pulls the sword from the stone and restores Britannia of old? He's like, I'm like, Askeladd does not seem like the type that believes in Arthurian legends, but we're learning all sorts of things about him in this episode, so maybe. I'm like, does he think Canute is Arthur? Okay. Is Thorfinn Lancelot? I don't know. I'm so fascinated. But yeah, we've talked a lot about this, and I've talked for a long time about this episode. Oh man, I lost track of time. And restore the old Britannia of old. I'm like, what the heck? But then we cut away. We don't get any more of that. So maybe there's an Arthurian legend. Maybe the general and Askeladd believe in it. Maybe they think Canute is going to fulfill that legend. He's going to be King Arthur. I don't know. I'm so fascinated. So meanwhile, the ear comes up to Bjorn and tells him that something is suspicious. And he tells Askeladd, he's like, and they, of course, they don't tell us. He's like, are you sure? He's like, that's what the ear says. And he's like, well, damn. So it's an ambush, right? And so these guys, thank you for coming, Prince of Danes. It's like they're messengers from the kingdom. And so he's like, wait. So he thinks the general doesn't know, and he tells him. So these messengers that knew they were coming, he's like, yeah. He's like, how can you tell? One of my men has good hearing. He's like, it's too late. This guy with the bowl cut. And so I guess it's a good thing that Thorfinn is with Canute, because Thorfinn is probably the best bet Canute has as being a bodyguard. I like that Thorfinn has gone from being charged to go get Thorkell's head to, hey, can you protect this kind of weakly prince, please? Like, Thorfinn's just, he's applying all sorts of things to his resume. Let's say that. Thorfinn's applying all sorts of things to the resume, and even he notices that something's up, right? It's like, what's wrong? And so then Thorfinn's like, something doesn't feel right. He's like, I've known about when an ambush has been coming since I was 6 years old. Like, But yeah, of course. And they draw their arrows. And man, so then Askeladd's like, well, shit. And then we cut to Thorkell, who has the leaf in his hand, crushing it. I'm like, did Thorkell send word? Did Thorkell find way to send word to the people of the Bee Kingdom saying, hey, these guys are coming your way, crush them? Don't know. The way he crushes that leaf kind of suggests that, right? Him saying like, And yeah, he looks across the sea like he's just waiting. Yeah, I have a feeling Thorkell had a hand in that. And then we cut to the castle, or the palace, and we see the king drinking from his glass, and like his lips are chapped, and he just looks withered and old. Yeah, he just looks like a withered old man sitting in an empty palace with just his men surrounding him, ready to go. And then I was like, so we're gonna leave off with this ambush, which I thought there's like 4 endings to this episode. I thought it was gonna end with Thorkell, thought it was gonna end with the king, and then we get Leif, our handsome Leif. He's gone bald and he's aged 10 years. Oh. And he sees the slave, and he thinks it's Thorfinn, but it's not. It's just a blonde kid that kind of looks like Thorfinn. And he's like, oh. And he doesn't. And the sad thing is, I'm sure he doesn't know for sure. I feel so sad for Leif, because he doesn't know where Thorfinn is. He's still looking for him, but his ship only has like a crate and a couple barrels of wine in it. So we don't know what's happened to Thorfinn's village in Iceland. We don't know if it's been destroyed, if what's happened to it. We don't know if Leif is still there, if he's like moved on and he's still just going from port to port looking for Thorfinn. He's been doing that for 10 years. I'm like, Leif, I was so sad that we saw him in this episode, and he looks so sad. God. Oh, so is he in Askeladd's village though? Was he in the village where Askeladd's uncle was from? Because we see the 3 docks. Interesting. Okay. And then God, on the one hand, if they were aiming for the horse, if the arrows were aiming for the horse, they hit their mark very well. They nailed its face. But if they're aiming for Askeladd, then their aim's for shit. So I was like, oh my God. But he manages to jump off the horse so fluid. I'm like, Askeladd, our dude, like just leaping off that horse like it's nothing. Oh my God. It had to have been that they were aiming for the horse. Had to have been. And he's like, well, great. Now we can't go. And Thorfinn's like, time to go protect the prince, who looks terrified. Pale and terrified. Thorfinn's like, I didn't sign up for this. Even though they're the same age. And it's just like, him looking on the... I wondered if he looked up there at the guys aiming their arrows and thought of his father and thought of the ambush from back in episode 4 that killed his dad. I thought if he thought about that and that's what he was seeing. Yeah. And that's the episode. Oh my gosh. So yeah. This was probably one of my favorite episodes so far. Not a lot of crazy things, not a lot of things happen in it. It's not like an action-packed episode at all. But what I love about it is that we're peeling back layers with characters. We are setting up ideologies and things to come. It's definitely a setup episode, but we're at the halfway point, and it's setting things up to be further explored maybe come the second half of the series. And so that's why I like it so much. But this episode was great. I had a lot of fun with it. So I'm very curious to know your thoughts down below. Please no spoilers, hints, or clues. But if you're going to put them down in the comments below, if you guys want to talk about spoilers amongst yourselves, just please spoiler tag so that I don't see it. But otherwise, bring on episode 13. I'm ready for the second half. I'm assuming we'll get a new OP and ED in the next episode, but we'll find out. So in the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'll be back very soon with episode 13 of Vinland Saga.